Gary Hutchins had been married to Carol for 36 years, and in all that time, through 2 kids, 3 houses, one bankruptcy scare, a cancer scare that turned out to be nothing, and the slow, grinding passage of middle age into something quieter and harder to name, he had never once struggled to talk to her. They had the kind of marriage that other couples envied from the outside and occasionally found claustrophobingly close on the inside. They talked about everything: finances, fears, the kids, the neighbors, the news, their health, their regrets, their small daily joys. Carol used to say that Gary was the only man she had ever met who actually wanted to talk after dinner. So it was strange, genuinely, uncomfortably strange, that for the past 14 months, there was one subject Gary had been completely, carefully, and deliberately avoiding. He was 63 years old. He had retired from 27 years as a civil engineer the previous spring. He was in reasonable health. He walked 3 miles every other day, kept his weight within 10 pounds of where it had been at 50, and took the standard medications that men his age accumulated the way they accumulated reading glasses and back braces. By most measures, Gary Hutchins was doing fine, except for this one thing. This one thing that nobody talked about, that his doctor had never brought up, that his friends, the ones he still played golf with on Fridays, had never once mentioned in all their years of easy locker room conversation. This one thing that had started as an occasional absence, then became a pattern, then became a presence in his marriage so heavy and unaddressed that it sat between him and Carol at dinner some nights, like a third person neither of them would acknowledge. His desire was gone. Not reduced. Not occasionally slow. Gone. At first he had told himself it was stress. The transition into retirement had been harder than expected. The loss of structure, the loss of identity, the strange grief of no longer being needed in the specific way he had been needed for 3 decades. He was adjusting. It would pass. He was tired. He was 63. This was normal, but the months kept going by and it did not pass. And what had started as a private inconvenience had slowly become a private wound. Not for him alone, though God knew it pressed on him every day, but for Carol too, though she never said a word. He saw it in the way she didn't reach for his hand the way she used to, in the way she started going to bed earlier, alone, with her book and not waiting up, in the way their good mornings became efficient rather than warm. Nothing dramatic. No fights. No accusations. Just a slow, quiet widening of the space between them, the kind of distance that does not announce itself, but simply arrives one day and makes itself at home. Gary had finally typed his question into his phone late on a Wednesday night, sitting in his truck in the driveway for 20 minutes before coming inside, because he did not want Carol to see the screen. He had felt typing those words, low-sex drive men over 60 causes, the particular shame of a man who had been strong his whole life and was now admitting, even to a search engine, that something had failed him. What he found surprised him. Not the volume of information. The internet had plenty of that, most of it selling something. What surprised him was a single video from a channel he had never heard of, hosted by a doctor named Reeves, who opened by saying something Gary had not expected any medical professional to say on camera. "If you're watching this," the doctor said, looking directly into the lens with a straightforwardness that felt almost confrontational, "you probably haven't told your doctor about this. Most men don't. And I want you to know, before I say anything else, that what you're experiencing is not a character flaw. It is not weakness. It is not the end of anything. It is a physiological event with a physiological solution, and the fact that nobody has explained this to you yet is a failure of the medical system, not a failure of you." Gary sat in the driveway for another 40 minutes. He watched the whole video twice. Then he went inside, kissed Carol on the forehead while she read, and said, "I found something I want to tell you about." She looked up at him over her reading glasses. He sat down on the edge of the bed, which was something he had not done in a very long time, and he told her what the doctor had said. Carol set her book face down on the nightstand. She did not say, "I knew something was wrong." She did not say, "Finally." She just listened. And when he finished, she said, "Okay, so what do we do?" Gary had not realized until that moment how much of the weight he had been carrying alone. It came off his shoulders so fast it almost made him dizzy. "There's a thing he says to try tonight," Gary said. "It takes 1 minute." Carol reached over and turned off her lamp. "Then let's try it," she said. What Dr. Reeves discovered in 20 years of men who stayed silent. Dr. Franklin Reeves had spent 2 decades as a men's health specialist in Portland, Oregon, and in that time he had developed what he called a waiting room theory about male patients over 60. The theory was simple. By the time a man over 60 brought up a sexual health concern in a clinical setting, he had typically been living with it for somewhere between 18 months and 3 years. He had tried to ignore it, rationalize it, wait it out, and research it privately before he ever said a single word to anyone with a medical degree. The cost of that silence, Dr. Reeves had found, was significant. Not primarily the physical cost, though that was real enough. The deeper cost was relational. Marriages strained under the weight of an unspoken thing. Men withdrew emotionally because the physical withdrawal felt too exposed to address directly. Women blamed themselves in ways that were completely unwarranted but entirely human. And by the time the conversation finally happened, and if it happened at all, there was often a layer of hurt and distance on top of the original problem that made everything harder to fix. The medical system has failed men in this area in a very specific way, Dr. Reeves said in the video. We screen for prostate cancer. We check testosterone levels if a man reports fatigue. But we almost never have a proactive, normalized conversation about sexual vitality as a component of overall health in men over 55. So men fall through the gap. They get older, things change, nobody explains why, nobody offers solutions, and they draw the only conclusion that makes sense with the information they have, that this is just what getting old looks like. And that conclusion is wrong. The physiological reality, as Dr. Reeves laid it out, was grounded in a system that most men over 60 had never heard of in the context of their own desire: the parasympathetic nervous system and its relationship with a specific hormonal and vascular cascade that governed not just erection, but libido, the actual initiating desire, at the neurological level. Testosterone got most of the attention when men discussed sexual decline after 50, and testosterone was genuinely relevant. Levels did decline with age, and that decline did affect mood, energy, and desire. But what Dr. Reeves had observed in his practice, and what the research increasingly supported, was that testosterone was often not the primary bottleneck. The primary bottleneck in the majority of men who reported low desire without severely depleted testosterone levels was chronic activation of the sympathetic nervous system, the same fight-or-flight circuitry that governed stress response, combined with poor pelvic floor muscle tone and restricted blood flow to the pelvic region. In plain language, these men were too stressed and too sedentary in a very specific set of muscles for their bodies to produce the neurochemical conditions that desire required. Desire, Dr. Reeves explained carefully, was not purely psychological. It had a physical on-ramp. It required the body to be in a particular state, parasympathetic dominant, well-oxygenated, with sufficient blood flow to the pelvic floor and sufficient neurological sensitivity in the relevant tissue. Chronic stress disrupted that state. Prolonged sitting compressed it. Age-related hormonal shifts further reduced the margin for error. The result was a man whose body was, in the most literal, biochemical sense, not creating the conditions for desire to arise, and who had no idea that this was a mechanical issue rather than a personal one. Here is what I tell my patients, Dr. Reeves said. Your body is not broken. Your body is responding perfectly rationally to the inputs it's been given. Chronic stress signals, not safe, not stable, not appropriate time for reproduction or intimacy. Sedentary pelvic floor, reduced sensitivity, reduced blood flow, reduced neurological responsiveness. No one has ever deliberately given your pelvic floor a reason to activate in 30 years. So it hasn't. This is not failure. This is atrophy from disuse. And atrophy from disuse responds to use. The solution Dr. Reeves described was built around two components that worked together. The first was a 60-second pelvic floor activation sequence, not the standard Kegel exercise that most men, if they had heard of it at all, associated exclusively with bladder control. This was a specific, progressive 3-movement sequence: a slow contraction held for 5 seconds, a full release held for 5 seconds, a rapid pulse series of 10 short contractions, then a final 5-second hold combined with a deep diaphragmatic exhale. Total time 60 seconds. Done daily, ideally in the morning and before intimacy. The mechanism was dual. The physical contractions increased blood flow to the pelvic region and began rebuilding neuromuscular sensitivity in tissue that had, in many cases, been neurologically quiet for years. The combination with deep diaphragmatic breathing simultaneously shifted the nervous system toward parasympathetic dominance, creating the precise neurochemical environment in which desire could be generated. The second component was what Dr. Reeves called thermal priming, a practice so simple that many of his patients initially dismissed it before discovering it worked. Every morning for the final 60 seconds of a shower, turn the water to cool, not ice cold, just noticeably cool, and stand with the water directed at the lower back and the backs of the thighs. This activated a specific cold shock response that triggered a measurable increase in testosterone production and dopamine release, both of which directly contributed to the neurochemical conditions for desire. The effect was temporary in isolation, but cumulative with consistent practice. Over 2 to 4 weeks of daily application, the baseline shifted. I have had men in their mid-60s and early 70s report changes within the first week that they describe as significant, Dr. Reeves said. Not restored to 25, not artificially amplified. Restored to what they should feel like at their age, which is not nothing, which is not absence, which is, for most of these men, something they had quietly made peace with losing and did not know they could get back. He paused. He looked at the camera. You don't have to make peace with losing things that haven't been fully lost, he said. That's not wisdom. That's just resignation. And you can do better than that. Gary had written 3 things on the back of a gas station receipt he found in his truck's cup holder because he had not had paper and did not trust himself to remember. 60 seconds. Pelvic sequence. Cool water. He had folded it into his shirt pocket and carried it inside like a small private piece of news he was not ready to share yet, but was no longer willing to ignore. The 30 days that gave Gary back something he thought was gone for good. Gary started the next morning. He stood in the bathroom at 6:50 with the door closed and felt, for about 30 seconds, like a man doing something mildly undignified in private. The pelvic floor sequence was not difficult. It was not painful. It required no equipment, no special position, no particular setting. He could do it standing at the sink. He could do it sitting in a chair. The muscle group involved was one he had been broadly aware of his whole life, without ever having deliberately used it for anything other than its most basic functions. The 60 seconds passed. Nothing dramatic happened. He felt a mild warmth, a faint awareness of a region of his body that he had not consciously attended to in years. He finished the shower with 30 seconds of cool water on his lower back and stepped out feeling, if not transformed, then at least like a man who had done something intentional for himself for the first time in a while. He told Carol about the details over coffee. Not the clinical explanation, he gave her the simplified version. A muscle group, blood flow, a nervous system thing. 60 seconds in the morning, cool water at the end of the shower. She listened the way Carol always listened, with her full attention and without making him feel watched. Then she said, "That's it?" Gary said that was it as far as the daily part. She nodded and poured herself more coffee. "Then do it every day," she said. "Don't skip." He didn't skip. The first week produced nothing he could point to and say, "There." No dramatic shift. No sudden return of the feelings he remembered from 20 years ago. What he noticed, if he was honest with himself, was subtler. A very slight increase in his overall morning energy, which he could not be sure was related. A marginally better mood on day 4 and day 6. A couple of mornings where he woke up with a physical awareness that had been absent for so long he had forgotten to expect it. Nothing consistent, nothing certain, but something present that had not been present before, and that he chose to treat as a signal rather than a coincidence. He also did something else in the first week, something he had been avoiding. He made an appointment with his doctor, and for the first time in 27 years of medical appointments, he told the truth about this specific thing. He described what he had been experiencing. He mentioned the timeline. He used the direct words rather than the softened ones. His doctor, a practical, unhurried man in his 50s named Dr. Carmichael, listened without reacting in any way that made Gary feel judged. He ordered a testosterone panel and a full metabolic workup and told Gary he would follow up in 2 weeks. Gary left the appointment feeling something unexpected, relief. The relief of a thing named. The relief of being in the room with someone else who now knew and who had received the information as ordinarily as he would have received a report of a sore knee. By the end of week 2, something had shifted enough that Gary noticed it without hunting for it. He did not analyze it too carefully. He was not that kind of man, the kind who cataloged feelings and cross-referenced them against expectations. But the distance that had been growing between him and Carol since the previous year had begun, quietly, to close. They were talking more at dinner. Real talking, not the efficient exchange of schedule and logistics that dinner conversation had become. One evening, Carol laughed at something he said, a real laugh, head back, hand on his arm, and Gary realized he had not heard that laugh in months and had not registered its absence until it returned. The physical changes followed the emotional ones, which, Gary reflected later, was probably the correct order. The body followed the warmth. The warmth came first, from the simple fact of a man paying attention to himself and his marriage again, deliberately, daily, without waiting for permission or a perfect moment. The desire that had been absent for 14 months did not return all at once like a light being switched on. It came back the way things come back when they have been ignored rather than destroyed. Gradually, uncertainly at first, then with increasing confidence, like a man finding his footing on ground he used to know. On a Friday evening in the fourth week, Gary and Carol had dinner at home with a bottle of wine Carol's sister had sent for their anniversary the previous month. They had been saving it for a special occasion without ever quite deciding what the occasion would be. That night, for no particular reason except that it felt right, Carol opened it. They ate slowly. They talked about their daughter's new apartment. They talked about a trip they had been meaning to take for years and kept not taking. Gary told Carol something he had not told her in a long time. Something specific, personal, and true about how he felt about her. Not a grand speech. Just a few honest sentences that surprised him by arriving when he hadn't planned them. Carol set down her glass. She looked at him for a moment. "You've been different this month," she said. Not as a complaint, not as a question, as an observation delivered with warmth. "I've been paying attention," Gary said. She picked up her glass again, and she smiled in a way that Gary recognized from a long time ago, from their early years, from before the children and the mortgage and the accumulation of ordinary life had layered themselves between the two of them and the simplest version of who they were to each other. Dr. Carmichael called the following week with Gary's blood work results. Testosterone was in the low normal range, below optimal but not clinical. The doctor recommended monitoring and lifestyle adjustments before considering anything pharmaceutical. Gary told him about the 60-second sequence and the cool water. The doctor was quiet for a moment and then said he was familiar with the pelvic floor approach and that the research was solid. He said to keep doing it. He said to come back in 3 months. Gary said he would. There is something that men of a certain generation were taught, implicitly, never directly, but taught nonetheless, that the correct response to the body changing is to say nothing, accept it, and get on with things. To complain about these particular changes was unmanly. To seek help for them was worse. To admit that something in this specific domain had diminished was to admit something about yourself that you were not supposed to admit, even to yourself. So men stayed quiet, and the silence compounded the problem in ways that were entirely predictable and entirely preventable. Gary thought about this one morning in the 5th week, standing at the bathroom sink, doing his 60 seconds before breakfast. He thought about how many men his age, in his neighborhood, on his golf course, in the waiting rooms of doctors' offices all across the country, were carrying the same weight he had been carrying. Were sitting in their trucks, in their own driveways, typing private questions into private phones, too ashamed to say the simple, accurate, human thing, "Something has changed, and I would like to know if I can do anything about it." The answer, Gary now knew, was yes. Not always the same yes, and not always the dramatic yes that late-night advertisements promised, but a real, grounded, accessible yes, built from 60 seconds in the morning, cool water at the end of a shower, an honest conversation with a doctor, and the simple decision to stop treating yourself as someone who had already finished. He thought about the gas station receipt still folded in his shirt pocket. He had washed the shirt twice since then, and the receipt had survived both washes, the ink blurred but legible. He had kept it there deliberately, he realized, not as a reminder. He no longer needed a reminder. But as a small private marker of the night, he sat in his truck in the dark and decided, finally, to stop pretending the problem wasn't there. Some decisions look small from the outside. 3 words on a crumpled receipt. 60 seconds at a bathroom sink. The last half minute of a morning shower. A conversation started on the edge of a bed instead of avoided for one more night. From the inside, those decisions feel like the difference between a man who is still arriving and a man who has given up on the journey without admitting it to himself. Gary Hutchins had not given up. He had just needed someone to tell him, plainly, without shame, without selling him anything, that the road was still open. That 63 was not a conclusion. That the man his wife had married was still in there, still present, still capable of showing up in all the ways that mattered. He was, and so very likely are you, 1 minute, every morning, starting today,